bitter greens and blackberries. The rain had not visited Portofino in days, and the afternoon sun lingered stubbornly on the terracotta rooftops, warming the pastel facades that clung to the hillsides like a painter's careful strokes. It was a heavy heat, the kind that pressed against the skin and slowed the pulse, making the air feel thick with unsaid things. Bougainvillea spilled over stone walls in defiant pinks and purples, their papery petals rustling in the dry breeze, and the Ligurian sea shimmered below, deceptively calm, a sheet of hammered turquoise glass that hid the currents churning beneath. From the open window of Julia's kitchen, the scent of salt mingled with basil and garlic, the village breathing in and out with the tide. It was a smell that usually brought her comfort, a reminder of the generations of women who had stood at similar windows, looking out at the same sea, worrying about the same kinds of men. But today, the scent felt sharp, almost accusatory. Julia stood at the worn wooden counter, her apron tied tight around her waist, its fabric faded from years of washing and dusted with the ghost of flour from 1,000 loaves. She moved with purpose, almost ferocity, as if each slice of her knife into ripe tomatoes were a punctuation mark in a sentence she had been rehearsing for years. The tomatoes surrendered easily, their crimson flesh pooling onto the cutting board, staining her fingers red, a visceral reminder of the heart she felt she was carving out of her own chest. She talked to herself as she cooked, as she often did, her voice rising and falling theatrically, mimicking the flamboyant cooking show host she adored, a woman with wild hair and wilder opinions who treated a soufflé like a lover and a burnt roast like a tragedy. If there had been a camera, Julia knew she would have been magnificent, gesturing grandly with her spoon, smiling knowingly at an imaginary audience, whispering conspiratorial secrets about seasoning and timing. "Always let the garlic kiss the oil," she said aloud, tossing the finely chopped cloves into the pan where olive oil shimmered and onions softened. The sizzle was immediate and gratifying, a violent hiss that filled the silence of the empty house. Never rush this part. You must let them get to know each other before the heat consumes them. Tonight was not simply about food. Tonight was strategy. Performance. Survival. With an exhaustion that made her chest ache, a dull throb behind her ribs. It wasn't the sharp, blinding pain of the first time, 5 years ago, when she had found the lipstick on a collar and cried in silence in the bathroom, blaming herself for being too tired, too plain, too consumed by the house. It wasn't the fiery rage of the second time, 2 years later, when she had confronted him, voice trembling, only to be met with denials and apologies that rang hollow, performances of remorse that were as thin as cheap paper. This time, the discovery had been quiet. A text message left open. A name she didn't know. A meeting time. It was the banality of it that broke her. He wasn't even trying to be clever anymore, he was just careless. He had become comfortable in his deceit, treating her forgiveness as a renewable resource, something he was entitled to simply because he came home for dinner. This time, she chose something different. This time, she cooked. The kitchen, with its cracked tiles and copper pots hanging from hooks like trophies of domestic wars, had always been Julia's refuge. She had learned to cook at her mother's side, standing on a stool, inhaling steam and stories in equal measure. Her mother had taught her that food was never just sustenance, it was a form of communication. Love, anger, grief, hope, all could be folded into dough or simmered into sauce. A heavy ragout for a cold winter, a light lemon risotto for a reconciliation, a bitter digestive for a hard truth. She stirred the onions and garlic, adding crushed tomatoes, basil, oregano, and a pinch of something darker, memory, perhaps. The sauce bubbled gently, thickening, transforming. Julia hummed an old Italian love song, one her mother used to sing while hanging laundry, a song about devotion and betrayal, about women who endured the sea and the silence. "It won't be much longer," Julia murmured, though she wasn't sure whom she was reassuring, herself or the man in the next room. In the living room, Enzo reclined on the sagging couch, one arm draped lazily over the back. He had not moved much since returning home from work, a euphemism that now tasted like ash in Julia's mouth, other than to kick off his expensive leather shoes and turn on the television. His face was relaxed, complacent, the face of a man who believes he owns his world and everyone in it. Julia glanced at him through the doorway, her reflection faintly visible in the darkened television screen behind him, a ghost haunting her own life. Once, that sight would have softened her. Once, she would have remembered his laugh, the way his hands felt rough and warm against her back, the way he said her name when they were newly married, and the world was just the two of them in a small room with a view of the harbor. She remembered the Enzo who used to bring her wildflowers from the roadside, not out of guilt, but out of joy. That man was gone, eroded by years of small compromises and selfish choices. Now, the sight of his relaxation, his utter lack of guilt, hardened her resolve like clay in a kiln. She filled a pot with water and set it to boil, salting it generously until it tasted like the sea. Her hands, marked with faint scars and sunspots, moved without hesitation. These hands had built a life, meals prepared, gardens tended, linens washed, children raised and sent off into the world. These hands had forgiven more than they should have. They were strong hands, capable hands. Dangerous hands. As the pasta cooked, she turned her attention to the salad. This was the centerpiece, the Trojan horse. She selected the greens with the precision of an apothecary. Endive, crisp and pale, like cold marble. Radicchio, its purple veins sharp and bitter, a vegetable that fought back against the tongue. Bitter greens, gathered that morning from her small garden behind the house, where the soil was dark and rich. And blackberries, dark, ripe, almost too sweet, picked from the tangled brambles along the edge of the village path, where the thorns had scratched her arms, drawing tiny beads of blood that she hadn't bothered to wipe away. She washed them carefully, one by one, as if they deserved reverence. The contrast was beautiful, the aggressive bitterness of the greens against the cloying, dark sweetness of the berries. It was a salad of contradictions, just like her marriage. The dressing came together simply: olive oil, vinegar, salt. And one final addition, drawn from a small vial hidden in the cupboard behind the flour, wrapped in a linen handkerchief. Julia's mind drifted back to 3 days ago, to the long walk up the goat path into the hills behind Portofino. She had gone to see Signora Ilera. The locals called her a striga, a witch, but they said it with a mixture of fear and respect, and they always lowered their voices. Ilera lived in a stone cottage that seemed to have grown out of the mountain itself, surrounded by drying herbs that hung from the eaves like sleeping bats. Ilera was ancient, her face a map of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and black as obsidian. She had listened to Julia's story without interrupting, her gnarled hands shelling peas into a wooden bowl. When Julia finished, weeping not from sadness but from a terrible, hollow frustration, Ilera had nodded. "You do not want poison," the old woman had said, her voice sounding like dry leaves scraping together. "Poison is for cowards. You want the truth. The truth is heavier than death, child. It is the burden we spend our lives trying to put down." She had gone into the back of her cottage and returned with the vial. The liquid inside was clear, unassuming. It looked like water, like tears. "This will not kill him," Ilera had warned, pressing the cold glass into Julia's palm. "But it will strip the filter from his mind. The gate between the thought and the tongue will be broken. He will speak only what is true, what is buried. Be sure you want to hear it, Julia. The truth has no manners." "I want to hear it," Julia had said. "I want him to hear it." Now, standing in her kitchen, Julia's hand did not shake as she uncorked the vial. She poured every drop into the dressing, whisking it vigorously until it emulsified with the oil and vinegar. It vanished instantly, odorless and colorless. The aroma of the meal, the rich tomato sauce, the sharp garlic, the earthy herbs, drifted through the house, wrapping Enzo in familiarity. It was the smell of his home, his sanctuary, the place where he was fed and cared for regardless of his sins. He rose from the couch, drawn to the kitchen by instinct and appetite. When he leaned against the doorframe, watching her, their eyes met. There was a flicker, recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of something they once shared. For a second, he looked like the boy she had married. "Smells incredible," Enzo said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Is that your mother's sugo finto?" Julia nodded, saying nothing. She couldn't trust her voice yet. She plated the pasta carefully, garnishing it with fresh basil. She placed the large bowl of salad in the center of the table, the blackberries glistening like dark jewels amongst the pale and purple leaves. The dining table, small and scarred from years of family dinners, looked almost ceremonial under the soft light of the overhead fixture. She uncorked their favorite local wine, a heavy Primitivo, pouring it into crystal glasses they reserved for anniversaries and holidays. The wine was dark, nearly opaque, and as it caught the light, Julia thought of all the things that lived beneath the surface of deep water. "Sit," she said. They ate in silence at first. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware and the distant hum of a scooter on the road below. Enzo sighed with pleasure, twirling pasta around his fork, chewing slowly. He ate with the gusto of a man with a clear conscience. His face softened, his eyes growing distant as the comfort of the food worked its magic. "You've outdone yourself, woman," he said at last, leaning back and wiping his mouth with a napkin. He reached for the salad bowl, serving himself a generous portion. Julia watched his fork pierce a blackberry and a leaf of radicchio. She watched him lift it to his mouth. She watched him chew. "The greens are bitter," he noted, frowning slightly, "but the berries, they are sweet. It works. It's good." "It's a balance," Julia said, her voice steady. "Like life. You need the bitter to understand the sweet." Enzo chuckled, taking a sip of wine. "You're philosophical tonight. What's the occasion? Did I forget an anniversary?" Julia stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. The sound was harsh in the quiet room. Her expression changed, no longer warm, no longer accommodating. The mask of the dutiful wife slipped away, revealing the stone beneath. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the empty vial, setting it on the table between them. "What is that?" Enzo asked, glancing at the glass. A flicker of unease crept into his voice, a primal instinct warning him of a shift in the atmosphere. "A secret ingredient," she replied evenly. "Did you taste something different in the dressing? Something revealing?" His smile faltered. He looked from the vial to her face, and for the first time in years, he really looked at her. He saw the lines around her eyes, the set of her jaw, the cold fire in her gaze. "It's a potion," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "One to bind us forever." Enzo's face drained of color. He laughed, a nervous, jagged sound. "Julia, stop it. You're scaring me. What is this nonsense? A potion? Don't worry, tesoro mio. You will not die. But there will be days you wish you had." Her voice was calm, almost tender, the way a doctor speaks before setting a broken bone. "This elixir will strip away your lies. You will feel the weight of every deceit, and you will speak the truth, whether you want to or not." Enzo stood up, his chair toppling backward. "You're crazy. I'm leaving." He turned toward the door, but his hand froze on the back of the chair. He blinked, shaking his head as if trying to clear water from his ears. A look of profound confusion crossed his face. He opened his mouth to say "I'm going to the bar," but his throat convulsed. "I'm going to see Isabella," he said. The silence that followed was absolute. Enzo clapped a hand over his mouth, his eyes widening in horror. He hadn't meant to say that. The name had just fallen out. "Isabella," Julia repeated, the name tasting like bile. "The one from the bank? Or is she new?" "She's the receptionist at the hotel," Enzo blurted out, his hand still over his mouth, the words muffled but audible. He pulled his hand away, staring at it as if it had betrayed him. "She's 24. She thinks I'm rich. I bought her a bracelet with the money we were saving for the roof." "Stop," he yelled at himself, grabbing his hair. "Why am I saying this?" "Because you can't help it," Julia said, sitting back down and taking a sip of her wine. She felt a strange, cold detachment, as if she were watching a play. "Sit down, Enzo. We have a lot to talk about." He collapsed back into his chair, his body trembling. The dam had broken. The first confession had been a pebble, now came the landslide. I don't love her, he vomited the words out, his face contorted in agony. I don't love any of them. I just love that they don't know me. They don't know I'm weak. They don't know I'm afraid of getting old. They look at me like I'm a king, and you look at me like you know exactly who I am. And who are you, Enzo? I'm a fraud, he whispered, tears leaking from his eyes. I borrowed money from your brother to pay off gambling debts 3 years ago. I told you it was for the car. I hate the way you hum when you cook. It reminds me of your mother, and she always saw through me too. I stayed late last Tuesday not for work, but because I sat in the car by the harbor and cried because I felt empty, and then I went to a bar and flirted with the waitress just to feel alive again. He cried. He begged for it to stop. He confessed things Julia had never suspected, petty thefts, small cruelties, moments of cowardice, and some she had known in her bones for years. He told her about the women, yes, but he also told her about his jealousy of her strength, his resentment of her garden, his fear that she was the only good thing in his life and that he had already ruined it. She listened, silent and still. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the plates. She simply bore witness. It was painful, yes, each confession was a lash, but it was also clarifying. The fog of gaslighting, the years of wondering if she was crazy or paranoid, evaporated. The night wore on. The candles burned down to nubs, the wax pooling on the tablecloth. The moon tracked its arc across the sky, illuminating the wreckage of their marriage scattered across the dinner table. By the time dawn crept through the windows, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays, Enzo was emptied of secrets. He sat slumped in his chair, his voice hoarse, his eyes red and swollen. He looked smaller, deflated, like a balloon that had lost its air. The potion had done its work. There was nothing left inside him but the raw, shivering truth. Exhausted, he stumbled to bed, unable to look her in the eye, leaving Julia alone in the quiet kitchen. She sat at the table, the remnants of the feast before her. The pasta was cold and congealed. The salad was wilted, the blackberries staining the bowl like ink. Julia felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. It wasn't triumph. There was no victory in knowing your husband was a hollow man. It wasn't revenge. Revenge was hot, and she felt cool, like the morning air. It was clarity. For years, she had been fighting a shadow, trying to catch smoke with her bare hands. Now, the lights were on. She saw the cracks in the walls, the dust in the corners. She saw Enzo not as a monster, but as a pathetic, broken thing. And she saw herself not as a victim, but as a survivor. She stood up and began to clear the table. She scraped the leftovers into the bin, the bitter greens, the sweet berries, the cold pasta. She washed the dishes, the rhythm of the water and the soap soothing her. She dried the crystal glasses and put them away. She would rebuild. Or she would walk away. She would sell the house, or she would kick him out. She would plant a bigger garden. She would travel. The options unfurled before her like a map she was seeing for the first time. Either way, she was no longer blind. The embers of their love had dimmed, perhaps extinguished entirely by the flood of truth. But in the ashes, Julia found herself, stronger, sharper, awake. She looked out the window at the sunrise over the Ligurian Sea. The water was no longer deceptively calm, it was churning, alive, powerful. And Enzo? He would wake up. He would try to speak, to spin a story, to smooth things over. But the words would catch in his throat. He would look at her, and he would tell the truth. Always.